Hey guys, welcome aboard to Snoozy Voyager, and tonight we're doing something genuinely unhinged. We're asking the one question that your anxiety-riddled brain has probably never thought to ask. What if you were rich during the Black Death? Not a peasant, not a monk chewing on a prayer and a turnip. I mean loaded. Silk robes, stone manor, servants, a wine cellar, the whole deal. What if, somehow, you had money during the single worst pandemic in human history? The plague that killed somewhere between a third and half of all of Europe? Would your gold actually save you? Would your walls keep it out? Or would you discover, the hard way, that death does not accept payment plans? Before we find out, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Seriously, no pressure. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always 2 a.m. somewhere, and I respect that deeply. A lot of you have been asking for this one, the rich medieval experience. And I am beyond grateful you keep suggesting topics. This channel genuinely runs on your curiosity, and tonight your curiosity has taken us somewhere spectacular and slightly terrifying. Now. Before we begin, let's ask a few questions. If you were filthy rich in the year 1347, would your money actually buy you safety? Could you afford to just flee the plague? Could you pay someone to taste your food, watch your door, and make sure the sick people stayed on the other side of the moat? What did a medieval rich person even eat for breakfast? And was it actually better than the peasant's grey pottage, or just more expensive and equally disgusting? Did having a fancy house mean you slept better, or did stone walls just mean you froze more elegantly? Could you buy a good doctor, and if so, was a good medieval doctor actually good, or just expensive and wrong? Did money let you leave town before the plague arrived, or did you spend it on the finest leeches in the region? Did wealth give you more control, or did it just mean you had more things to lose? And now, congratulations. You've just woken up in 1347. You're wealthy. You have a manor, a household, a title, and servants. Outside your window, somewhere across Europe, something has started moving. A ship has docked, a rat has scurried, a flea has jumped. Your money is in a locked chest. The plague doesn't care. Good luck. Let's talk about your morning. You open your eyes in the year 1347, and the first thing you notice is that your bed is actually a bed, a real one, with a wooden frame, a proper straw and feather mattress, linen sheets, and a wool coverlet heavy enough to keep the cold from your bones. This is already a miracle by medieval standards. No barn floor, no communal pile of shivering relatives, no goat breathing on your ankles. You have a room, possibly even a door. You stretch, and nothing immediately bites you, at least not aggressively. This is what money buys you in the 14th century. Marginally fewer parasites and a mattress that remembers you were there. Your chamber has a fireplace. Not a hole in the roof with optimistic smoke drifting toward it, but an actual chimney-equipped fireplace, which a servant lit before you woke because lighting fires on command is one of the services you pay for. The room is cold. It is always cold. This is medieval Europe. The concept of ambient warmth is centuries away, but it is cold in the way a wealthy room is cold, which is to say slightly less cold than the outside. There are tapestries on the walls. They are both decorative and functional, trapping a thin layer of air between you and the stone, which in practice means the room goes from genuinely freezing to merely cold with some visual interest. Progress. You lie there for a moment in the kind of quiet that money buys. No one is sleeping directly next to you. No snoring uncle, no restless livestock, no child coughing in the dark. You have space. In the 14th century, personal space is a luxury so profound that most people never experience it in their entire lives. You have so much space you can stretch both arms out and not touch another person. This is essentially medieval first class. And yet, here is the thing nobody tells you about waking up wealthy in the year 1347. Outside your window, the world is already beginning its slow descent into something nobody has a word for yet. Trade ships have been docking in Sicilian ports. Genoese merchants have come home from the Black Sea port of Caffa with stories that do not make sense, Stories about bodies and swellings and people dying in days, sometimes hours. The stories are travelling the same routes the trade goods travel, which is to say, they are travelling very fast. In October of 1347, 12 Genoese trading ships will dock at the port of Messina. The port officials who approach them will find most sailors dead and the rest wishing they were. Sicily will beg the ships to leave. The ships will leave. It will not matter. But you do not know this yet. You're lying in your linen sheets in your stone manor with your tapestries and your personal fireplace, and the morning light is coming through the shuttered window in thin, cold lines, and a servant is about to knock to let you know that breakfast is ready. You feel, in this particular moment, like someone for whom things are reasonably under control. Outside somewhere, a rat is running along a dock, a flea is jumping, a ship is moving, and the thing that will kill between 30 and 60% of everyone in Europe, your servants, your neighbours, your physician, your priest, possibly your children, possibly you, is already on its way. It does not care about your fireplace. It does not care about your tapestries. It does not even care about your linen sheets. But it has not arrived yet. So for now you lie there in your comfortable bed, in your cold stone room, and you are, by the standards of your century, extraordinarily lucky. Enjoy breakfast. Let's talk about where you actually live, because this matters enormously. Your manor is made of stone, proper stone, not the daub and wattle mudstick situation most of England and France is built from. It has multiple rooms, a great hall, a solar for sleeping, a chapel, storage chambers, and a kitchen that is, critically, a separate building because kitchens burn down roughly every 4 to 6 years, and people had learned from bitter experience. There is a fireplace, a real one with a chimney, not a hole in the roof and a prayer. There are tapestries on the walls, which serve the dual purpose of decoration and insulation, because stone walls in winter are essentially expensive refrigerators. The windows have shutters. The wealthiest manors even have small panes of glass, which in the 14th century is roughly the medieval equivalent of a smart home system. The great hall is the beating heart of the house. Long trestle tables are set up for meals, dismantled and stored along the walls afterward, because medieval furniture is mostly furniture only some of the time. There is a raised platform at the far end, the dais, where you and your immediate household eat, slightly elevated above the rest, which is both literally and symbolically the point. Below the salt, and there is always a salt cellar on the table, an actual container of salt, not a shaker, sit your servants, your workers, the people of lesser status. Above the salt sits you. This is the medieval equivalent of a corner office. Salt is expensive. Its placement says everything. Your manor has a yard, outbuildings, possibly a garden and an orchard, stables, a well, and a perimeter wall or fence. It is a self-contained world, or at least it tries to be. In good times, this makes it a pleasant, well-ordered community. In a plague year, it makes it a very interesting strategic problem, because a self-contained world is only self-contained if you can actually control everything that comes in and out. And your manor in practice is full of gaps. The kitchen requires constant deliveries of food and fuel. The stables require farriers and feed suppliers. The fields require labourers who sleep in their own cottages in the village and walk to work each morning. Your household includes servants who visit family, run errands in town, attend the market every week without fail because someone has to buy things, and it is not going to be you. Your manor is less a fortress than a very large, permanently slightly open house, and in 1347 that distinction matters in ways that keep the more anxious residents awake at night. You have a gate, you have a wall, you have the legal and social authority to close both, to turn away visitors, to refuse entry to people who look sick or who come from infected areas. This is a genuine advantage. When plague begins moving through your nearest town, you can in theory seal yourself in, draw on your stores, and wait it out. Wealthy households across Europe attempted exactly this, with varying degrees of success and varying degrees of psychological deterioration somewhere around week 3. But here is the thing about your stone manor and your wall and your gate. The plague did not knock. It did not announce itself at the entrance and wait to be turned away. It arrived quietly, in the folds of a servant's clothing, in the fur of a rat that slipped under the kitchen door, in a flea that jumped from a delivery horse to a stable boy to the cook who made your dinner. Your fortress was beautiful. Your fortress was warm, well-stocked, and genuinely impressive by the standards of the century. Your fortress also had rats. Everyone's fortress had rats. That was the problem. It is time for breakfast, and unlike your peasant neighbours who are staring into a bowl of grey pottage and silent regret, you have options. Real options. There is white bread on your table, soft pale made from sieved wheat flour, the kind that screams wealth in a world where most people chew barley loaves that could deflect arrows. There is cold meat from last night, possibly some dried fish, hard cheese, butter and wine. Actual wine, not the watered-down vinegar most commoners are making do with. If it is a feast day, there might be something warm. There is spiced wine called hippocras, sweetened with honey and flavoured with cinnamon and ginger, which cost more per cup than a peasant earns in a week. The table is set with reasonable ceremony. Tablecloths exist. You have a personal knife, possibly a spoon, and enough of both to feel that eating is an occasion and not merely a biological necessity. Lower down the social scale, eating is conducted with whatever is at hand, often the same knife used for everything else that day, including things we will not discuss. Your knife is clean. It has a handle. This is, in the 14th century, a significant lifestyle distinction. Your cook has been up since before dawn. This is worth acknowledging. Someone else's suffering has made your morning comfortable, and the someone else is down in that separate kitchen building, sweating over a fire, managing ingredients that arrived at uncertain freshness, navigating a food supply chain held together largely by optimism and the fact that everyone has survived this long. Medieval kitchens are remarkable operations, producing complex multi-course meals for large households with no refrigeration, no thermometers, no food safety regulations, and no way to tell whether that salted pork is fine or whether tonight is going to be very interesting. Wealthy medieval diet was, by the standards of the era, genuinely good. The variety was real. Roasted meats, game birds, freshwater fish on the days the church insisted on it, which was roughly a third of the year, pastries, tarts, custards, blancmange. Dishes flavoured with imported spices that your cook deployed with a pride bordering on competitive. The spice trade from the East meant that a wealthy table smelled of cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg and ginger in ways that would seem extraordinary to anyone in the century below yours. Spices were used not just for flavour, but for preservation, and for the medical belief that warming spices protected the body against corruption and disease. Your doctor actively recommended spiced food. This was one of those rare moments when the enjoyable thing and the medically advised thing overlapped, which almost never happens in the 14th century, so you ate the spiced wine custard without guilt. And yet, and this is the deeply unsatisfying truth about being rich in the 14th century, food safety is still a medieval construct, which is to say it barely exists. Your white bread is a step up, but your kitchen has rats. Your meat has been hanging. Your well, however private, draws from groundwater that passes through soil that medieval agriculture has been composting with human and animal waste for generations. Your wine barrel has been in a cellar. The spices in your pantry are locked away and valuable, but they were handled by a lot of people between Calicut and your cook's hands. Wealth buys you better ingredients. It buys you a cook skilled enough to do something with them. It does not buy you a food inspector, a refrigerator, or the germ theory of disease. So you eat your white bread and your spiced wine and your cold roasted pheasant, and it is genuinely better than what most people are eating, and you are grateful for it. Just do not think too hard about the kitchen. Let's talk about the people who run your life, because a wealthy medieval household does not function without its servants, and there are a lot of them. We are talking cooks, stewards, chamberlains, ladies-in-waiting, stable hands, kitchen boys, laundresses, door wardens, and a handful of people whose exact job title you have never fully understood but who seem essential. They wake before you, light your fires, prepare your food, carry your water, empty your chamber pot. Yes, even you have a chamber pot, just a nicer one. Brush your clothes and generally make the whole enterprise of being wealthy function smoothly. A moderately wealthy medieval household might employ anywhere from 10 to 50 people, depending on the size of the estate and the ambitions of the lord. A great noble household could employ hundreds. Every function of daily life that you do not personally perform, which is most of them, is performed by someone employed specifically for that purpose. There is a person whose job is to taste your food before you eat it, just in case someone has tried to poison you. There is a person whose job is to sleep outside your chamber door. There is a person whose job involves the care of your hunting dogs, another whose job involves your horses, another who manages your accounts, another who manages the people who manage your accounts. The medieval wealthy did not lack for staff. What they lacked was any real ability to control what their staff brought home. Here is the thing about servants in 1347. You cannot do without them, and you cannot entirely control what they encounter. They go to market every week. They visit their families in the village on their days of relative freedom. They receive deliveries, handle goods, interact with merchants, talk to travellers, stand in churchyards after Mass and hear the news from other parishes. They move through the world you're trying to stay insulated from, and then they come back inside your gate, and they carry your water, and they make your food, and they brush your clothes. And most of the time this is fine. Most of the time it has always been fine, because most of the time the world outside your gate is simply the world. It is not carrying anything particular. But in this plague year, the world outside your gate is carrying something that travels in fleas, and fleas live on rats, and rats live everywhere, and the fleas do not stay on the rats. The fleas jump. That is essentially their only skill and their greatest achievement, and they are very good at it. Your servants are not villains in this story. They are people doing their jobs in good faith, living their lives in the only way available to them, completely unaware that the system which has always functioned, go to town, come home, serve the household, has suddenly become a delivery mechanism for something invisible and lethal. The tragedy of the medieval wealthy during the Black Death is not that they failed to care about their servants. Many of them did care, wrote about their losses in wills and chronicles and letters that survive today as documents of genuine grief. The tragedy is that caring and protecting were not the same thing, and the gap between them was the width of a flea. Your steward comes to report this morning's household business. He looks well. He was in town yesterday. He got back last night. He is standing at a respectful distance, as is the custom, waiting for your instructions. He looks completely fine. This is the thing about the plague that made it so devastating. For 2 to 7 days after infection, people looked completely fine. They went about their business. They came home. They touched things. You nod and tell him to send in the cook. Now it is time to get dressed, and this at least is a genuine pleasure of being wealthy in medieval Europe. Your wardrobe is nothing short of extraordinary by 14th century standards. You have multiple outfits, actual multiple outfits, a concept so radical for most people of this era that it borders on science fiction. The peasant has one tunic, worn every day until it disintegrates or achieves independent biological life, whichever comes first. You have options. You have a chest, possibly 2, filled with folded garments representing more textile value than most people will accumulate in a lifetime. There is fine wool, dyed in deep crimson or rich blue or forest green, colours that require expensive imported dyes, and therefore signal status to everyone in a 3-mile radius. Scarlet cloth specifically was among the most expensive textiles available in medieval Europe, dyed with kermes, a dye made from crushed insects which is exactly as labour-intensive as it sounds. Wearing scarlet said without words that you had spent a small fortune on the specific shade of your sleeve. Medieval fashion was not subtle about its intentions. There is linen underneath, soft and clean by the standards of the era, changed more frequently than your peasant counterpart's single garment has ever been washed in its entire existence. This matters medically in a blunt way. Skin that is regularly clean is skin that harbours fewer parasites, fewer infections, fewer of the low-level miseries that accumulate on a body never washed. You're not immune to fleas, nobody is in the 14th century, but you have fewer of them, and you know when they are there, which is the beginning of being able to address the problem. There are furs along the collars and cuffs, marten, ermine, fox. These are functional in the cold, and they are also status markers of such precision that sumptuary laws in many parts of Europe legally regulated which furs could be worn by which social class. Ermine, the white winter coat of the stoat, was reserved for royalty and the highest nobility. Wearing the wrong fur in the wrong place was a social crime with legal consequences. Medieval Europe took its fabric hierarchy extremely seriously, which tells you something about how deeply people needed visible markers of status in a world without name tags. You have shoes, real leather shoes, shaped to the specific contours of your feet, soft-soled and buckled, made by a craftsman who measured you and spent actual time on the construction. They keep your feet dry in ways that the peasant's rag-wrapped bare feet cannot. They protect you from the accumulated biological material of the medieval street, which is doing its best out there and not quite succeeding. They are comfortable, which in the 14th century is a remarkable achievement for footwear. A servant helps you dress. This is not laziness. Some of the fastenings on wealthy medieval garments are genuinely impossible to manage alone, positioned at the back, requiring both hands working from an angle that human shoulders do not accommodate. The clothing is designed for a body attended to by other bodies. This is symbolically perfect. You look, when dressed, like someone who matters. The cut, the colour, the quality of the fabric, all of it communicates, in the visual language of the 14th century, that you are a person of consequence. People will step aside for you in the street. They will lower their eyes. They will address you with titles. And yet, as your servant clasps the final buckle and steps back, and you examine your reflection in the polished metal disc that stands in for a mirror, blurry, slightly distorting, showing you a vague impression of someone well-dressed and important. Somewhere across the sea, a ship has left port. Somewhere in the folds of a bale of cloth loaded onto that ship, something is waiting to be introduced to a new country. The clothes are beautiful. They will not help. But you look wonderful. Let's talk about your doctor. Because if you're going to be sick in the 14th century, being rich at least means you get to be wrong in the company of credentialed professionals. Your physician has studied at a university, Bologna perhaps, or Paris, and he has spent years reading Galen and Hippocrates in Latin, which in 1347 passes for a comprehensive medical education. He is a serious man who carries himself with the particular gravity of someone who charges by the visit and wants you to feel that each visit was worth it. His robes are long, his manner is grave, and his Latin is impeccable. If medicine were a performance, he would be receiving standing ovations. The theoretical basis of his practice is the theory of the four humours, developed by the ancient Greeks and endorsed by centuries of medical tradition. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Your health depends on keeping these in balance. Illness is imbalance. The cure for imbalance is intervention. The interventions available include bloodletting, purging, dietary adjustment, herbal remedies, and in more serious cases, consulting an astrological chart to determine which planetary configuration was responsible for your current condition. If you are feeling skeptical about the astrology component, please remember that this was not fringe thinking. This was the mainstream consensus of European medicine in 1347. The position of Saturn relative to Jupiter was considered a genuine etiological factor in illness. Peasants, when they could afford any medical attention at all, got the barber surgeon, the man who cut hair and pulled teeth and bled you with enthusiasm if not precision. You get the physician, the university-trained, Latin-reading, urine-examining, formally credentialed physician who charges significantly more and bleeds you with considerably more ceremony. The outcomes are, if we're being precise about this, essentially identical. But your bleeding comes with a dignified bedside manner and a learned explanation, which in 1347 is worth something in terms of comfort, if not in terms of survival. When you fall ill, the physician comes to your manor. This is the first and most tangible benefit of wealth. He comes to you. The poor go to him, or more often, go to nobody. He examines your urine in a glass flask, holding it to the light with an expression of concentrated expertise. He checks your pulse. He asks about your diet, your emotional state, your dreams, your bowel movements. He wants to know if you've been around marshes or miasmatic air or emotional extremes. He will then deliver a diagnosis with the confidence of a man who has never been told he was wrong, because his patients rarely live to complain. His treatment for early plague symptoms, fever, headache, fatigue, will probably begin with bloodletting and dietary restriction. When the buboes appear, the swollen lymph nodes that are the plague's signature, he will try lancing them, applying poultices, recommending aromatic fumigation of the room, and adjusting his astrological interpretation of the case. He will stand, increasingly, at a greater distance from the bed. This is not a quirk. Plague doctors across Europe became notorious for treating patients from as far away as the room permitted, which was both understandable and deeply unhelpful. At some point he will recommend that you settle your affairs. He will do this with great tact. He is a professional. He will frame it as a precaution, a prudent measure, in case the crisis deepens. He will quote Hippocrates. He will charge for the consultation. And then, with great dignity and a very well-organized exit, he will leave. Medieval medicine did not fail you because it was lazy. It failed you because it was working from a completely wrong model of how disease worked, built on 2,000 years of sincere, earnest, completely mistaken effort. You paid the best available price for the best available wrong answer. That is the medical economy of the 14th century in its entirety. Let's talk about your soul, because in the 14th century, rich or poor, the church is not optional. Religion is not a Sunday morning activity you participate in when convenient. It is the architecture of every single day, the framework that gives your suffering meaning and your prosperity explanation and your death, a context that extends beyond the purely physical. You wake to the sound of bells. You pray before meals, after meals, and at 8 specific canonical hours throughout the day if you are devout, or a more manageable subset of them if you are moderately devout, which is the category most wealthy people fall into when there is also a lot of estate management to attend to. You have a private chapel in your manor. This is the mark of real wealth. Your own personal priest, your own consecrated space, your own direct line to God without having to rub shoulders with the common people at the parish church. Your priest says Mass for your household every morning. He is on your payroll, which creates a relationship with divine intercession that has a mildly contractual quality to it, though no one says this out loud. You have paid for Masses to be said on behalf of your family, on behalf of your dead ancestors, on behalf of your future soul. You have possibly endowed a chantry. a small chapel where a hired priest prays specifically and continuously for your soul, a spiritual subscription service, effectively with the afterlife as the deliverable. The Church has been the dominant institution of European life for centuries by this point, and it is very good at its job, which is simultaneously providing genuine spiritual comfort, moral framework, community structure, and a certain amount of coercive authority that keeps the whole arrangement functioning. You believe, with the sincerity of someone who's never seriously encountered an alternative, in heaven and hell, in purgatory, in the efficacy of prayer, in the intercession of saints, in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, in the authority of the Pope, in the idea that your conduct in this life has direct and measurable consequences for your soul's condition in the next one. This is not performance. This is your cosmology. And then the plague arrives, and the Church faces a problem it has not encountered quite like this before. Because the plague is killing clergy at approximately the same rate as everyone else, in many cases faster, because priests who continued administering last rites to the dying were in constant proximity to the dying, which turned out to be epidemiologically significant. The Church is losing priests faster than it can train replacements. Standards for ordination are quietly lowered. Men who would not have been acceptable candidates a decade ago are being ordained because there is no one else. And the theological explanation, this is God's punishment for human sin, is doing some heavy lifting and beginning to buckle under the weight. Because if this is punishment for sin, the distribution of that punishment is puzzling. Holy men are dying. Children are dying. The devout are dying alongside the impious. The plague is not distinguishing between the prayerful and the negligent in any way that matches the theology's promises. Your priest offers what comfort he can. He is genuinely trying. He prays at your chapel every morning, swings his incense, says his masses, reminds you that suffering has meaning, that martyrdom in faith is a form of grace, that God's ways are not our ways. These are true things within the framework he inhabits, and he says them with conviction. You kneel on the cold stone of your private chapel floor and you pray, sincerely with everything you have. Outside the bells are ringing. They have been ringing constantly for 3 days, not the canonical hours, the death toll. You pray a little harder. Here is something the history books often gloss over with a polite cough and a subject change. Even rich people in the 14th century smelled. Not as bad as everyone else, let's be fair. The wealthy smelled meaningfully less than the population they lorded over, but the baseline of 14th century personal hygiene would fail a modern elevator test regardless of your tax bracket. This is not a failure of intelligence or character, it is a failure of infrastructure. Without running water, without modern soap, without the germ theory of disease to motivate thorough hand washing, and without deodorant, which does not exist and will not exist for several centuries, everyone in medieval Europe is operating at a sensory disadvantage by modern standards. That said, the wealthy have soap. Real soap made from wood, ash, lye and animal fat, or the imported variety from Castile made with olive oil, which is smoother, less caustic, and costs enough to make it a luxury item. They bathe more frequently than their peasant counterparts. A wealthy household has a wooden bathing tub, servants to haul water from the well and heat it over the kitchen fire, and the social expectation that bathing is an appropriate activity for people of status. There are written accounts of wealthy medieval people bathing regularly, weekly, sometimes more often, particularly before important occasions, feast days, or significant social events. This is not universal, and it is not by modern standards frequent, but it is dramatically more than nothing. Wealthy women had access to perfumes, rose water, lavender water, distillations of aromatic herbs produced in the still room, a dedicated space in the manor house for exactly this kind of fragrant alchemy. They tucked dried lavender and rose petals into clothing chests to scent linens. They scattered fresh herbs across floors, sweet rushes, meadowsweet rosemary, both for the smell and for the practical benefit of discouraging the insects that found medieval floors so hospitable. Your manor has actual sweet rushes on the floor. They were changed last month, which is recent by contemporary standards. You change your linen undergarments with a frequency that would be considered basic hygiene today, but passes for extravagance in the 14th century. This is not trivial. The linen layer against your skin absorbs sweat and oils, and is then washed away, which means you're not marinating indefinitely in your own biological output the way the single tunic population is. Clean linen is the 14th century's most underrated public health intervention. And yet, clean is a relative term in a world without the concept of microbial transmission. You are cleaner than almost everyone around you. You still have fleas. This is not a personal failing. It is a mathematical certainty. Fleas in the 14th century are simply a feature of existence, present in even the most well-maintained households, nesting in straw mattresses and floor rushes and the warm fur of every domestic animal, which is to say every household in Europe. The flea population of a wealthy manor was smaller, possibly, than the flea population of a peasant's hut. But smaller is not zero. And in a plague year, 0 is the only number that matters. Medieval people understood that cleanliness was desirable. They had aesthetic preferences about smell and appearance that were genuinely similar to modern ones. They were working without the tools to fully satisfy those preferences, and without the knowledge that some of what they could not clean, the fleas specifically, was the thing that was actually going to be a problem. You smell, by the standards of your century, quite good. By the standards of any other century you will ever be measured against. You smell like the 14th century. This is, in the circumstances, the best available outcome. Let's talk about running away, because this is genuinely one of the advantages of wealth in a plague year, and people absolutely used it without embarrassment or apology. When rumours began circulating in 1347 and 1348 that something terrible was moving through Sicily, through Genoa, through Florence, the wealthy of Europe faced a decision that the poor were not equipped to make, because the poor had nowhere to go and no way to get there. The wealthy had horses, they had carts, they had country estates located away from the crowded, rat-dense, sewer-adjacent conditions of the city. They had the legal right to travel, and the social infrastructure to be received somewhere at the other end. Fleeing was, in a very direct sense, a rich person's option. Giovanni Boccaccio wrote about this in the Decameron, a group of wealthy Florentines who abandon the plague-ridden city and retreat to a villa in the hills, where they tell each other stories and drink wine while the city below empties of the living. The Decameron is literature, but it is literature drawn directly from life. Boccaccio was in Florence during the plague and witnessed the flight of the wealthy firsthand. The retreat to the country was real, widespread, and, in the short term, sometimes effective. Distance from urban population density genuinely reduced exposure. The logic was sound, even if the understanding was wrong. You have a country property. It is smaller than your main manor, less comfortable, staffed by a skeleton crew of tenants and workers rather than a full household, but it exists and it is away from the city. The decision to go is not difficult to make in principle. It is the logistics that complicate things. You cannot simply ride away this afternoon. The household must be organised. Food and supplies must be loaded. The servants who are coming, the ones essential to your function and comfort, must be gathered and informed. The ones who are staying must be given instructions. The animals must be sorted. The valuables must be secured or transported. This process takes days, possibly a week. And during those days of preparation, the plague is still moving, still arriving in parcels and conversations in the afternoon market, and the breath of neighbours through thin walls. Then there is the road itself. Medieval roads are shared spaces, merchant caravans, pilgrim groups, fleeing populations all moving through the same corridors between cities. In a plague year, those roads carry a specific danger. Other people who are also fleeing, some of whom are fleeing because they are already sick, some of whom simply do not know it yet. Your convoy of horses and carts and servants and luggage moves through this landscape with no way to know who on the road beside you has already been touched by what you are running from. And the country estate, when you arrive, the tenants who farm your land out there, the small village clustered around the manor house, they have been living their lives too. They have been to their own markets, had their own visitors, traded with their own neighbours. The countryside was not sealed. No place was sealed. Some wealthy people fled early enough and far enough, and were received into households that happened not yet to be infected, and they survived, and later attributed their survival to the wisdom of their flight. Some fled early and died anyway, carrying the plague to new villages and seeding it in places it had not yet reached. Some fled late and died on the road. Some stayed and survived because chance, the great equalizer, favoured them in their stone manor with the closed gate. Money bought you the option of running. It could not tell you which direction to run. Let's talk about your pantry, because one of the genuine, measurable benefits of wealth in any period of crisis is the ability to stockpile. And a wealthy 14th century household had a larder that would make a nervous prepper weep with admiration. Down in your undercroft, the stone storage space beneath the main house, cool and dark and designed precisely for this purpose, there are barrels of salted fish, casks of wine and ale, sacks of grain, wheels of hard cheese wrapped in cloth, smoked and dried meats hanging from hooks, crocks of lard, pots of honey, jars of preserved fruit, sacks of dried beans and peas, and locked boxes of spices that cost more per ounce than silver. There's enough food in your undercroft to feed your entire household for months without a single delivery from the outside world. This is not accidental. Wealthy medieval households maintained substantial food stores as a matter of standard practice because the medieval food supply was unreliable. Harvest failed, roads became impassable in winter, and a household that ran out of provisions in February had a serious and potentially fatal problem. The wealthy stored food the way they stored money, carefully, in quantity, in locked spaces with trusted people in charge of the keys. Your steward knows exactly what is down there and keeps meticulous records of what comes in and goes out. In a plague year, this store transforms from a mundane household asset into the most important thing you own, because it is the thing that makes isolation possible. The theoretical plan is elegant. Close the gate, draw on the stores, admit nobody, wait out the plague. Wealthy households across Europe attempted exactly this with varying degrees of discipline and success. Boccaccio's fictional Florentines, remember, brought their provisions with them to the villa. They were not roughing it. They were conducting a comfortable, well-supplied retreat from civilization. which is a very different experience from hiding in terror. Your stores are genuinely good. The salted meat will keep for months if the salt held properly, and the barrels were sealed correctly, and the rats have not been at them. The grain will keep if it is dry, and the weevils have not got in. The cheese will keep if the cloth wrapping did its job, and the cold of the undercroft remained steady. Medieval food preservation is not science. It is a set of practices developed through trial, error, and the collective misery of everyone who ever opened a barrel and discovered things had gone in an unexpected direction. It mostly works. Mostly. But here is the variable nobody discusses when they picture the wealthy sealing themselves away and surviving comfortably on their stores. What actually lived in those stores alongside the food? Rats were not an occasional nuisance in a medieval undercroft. They was permanent residents, so expected and accepted that household accounts routinely mention spending on traps and cats. The cat, your manor's resident pest management team, was a valued working animal, not a pet. And still the rats were there, and the rats had fleas, and the fleas were not exclusively committed to the rats. You could lock your gate against people. Your undercroft was already occupied by the thing that mattered most. The stores were impressive. The stores were necessary. The stores were doing something else at the same time, quietly in the dark, with excellent results. And down in the undercroft, in the cool dark, your grain sack sat heavy and reassuring, and a rat ran along the wall, and a flea considered its options. It is evening. The fire is lit. Your wine has been warmed, and outside your walls the 14th century is doing what it does best, being a relentless, grim, theologically confusing experience. What do you do with yourself? Because here is another gap between wealthy medieval life and the peasant experience. Leisure exists for you. It exists in a real, structured, intentional way. The peasant collapses after dark because there is no light worth working by, no fuel to waste on entertainment, and the body has been so thoroughly destroyed by the day's labour that unconsciousness is the only reasonable next step. You, by contrast, have candles, actual wax candles, not the tallow rushlights that smell like a rendering house, and people whose job it is to make your evenings bearable. You have books, handwritten, illuminated manuscripts, painstakingly copied by monks in scriptoria over months or years, bound in leather, decorated with gold leaf and jewel-bright pigments, ground from lapis lazuli and malachite, imported from the other side of the world. They cost extraordinary sums. Most people in the 14th century will never own one. You have several, possibly a small collection, kept in a wooden chest or displayed on a reading stand in your solar. Your library might include a book of hours, the devotional text that structures daily prayer, perhaps a romance or two in French, possibly a chronicle of history, maybe a medical text your physician recommended and which you have never quite gotten around to reading. Literature in the 14th century is not a casual consumer product. It is an investment, an heirloom, and a statement about who you are. You have chess. Not the casual kitchen table version of later centuries, but chess as serious intellectual pursuit, associated in medieval culture with nobility, strategy, and refined thinking. Chess sets were luxury objects, carved from ivory or bone, fitted into velvet-lined boxes, brought out for evenings of genuine competitive play that could last hours. There are medieval manuscripts entirely devoted to chess strategy. This was the 14th century's version of staying mentally sharp, and it was taken with corresponding seriousness. You have music. A household musician, or several, who know the troubadour songs that drifted north from Provence over the past century, who can play lute or psaltery or harp with genuine skill, who can accompany the songs your guests know the words to, and fill a great hall with something that briefly makes the cold and the dark feel managed. Music in the medieval world was not background noise. It was an event, a skill, a shared experience that required performers and engaged listeners. Your household musician is employed, fed, housed, and valued, one of the more comfortable positions in your establishment, as long as you enjoy the repertoire. You have, in normal times, the pleasure of guests. Wealthy medieval social life is built on hospitality, the obligation to receive travellers of equivalent status, to host feasts on important occasions, to maintain relationships through the physical ritual of sharing food and wine under your roof. These gatherings are how news travels, how alliances are maintained, how the social world of the 14th century functions. They are also, in a plague year, becoming increasingly complicated. Because every guest is a potential carrier, every visitor from the city a potential conduit, and the social obligation of hospitality, which is genuinely an obligation, a moral and practical duty, is now in direct conflict with the instinct toward isolation. So you sit by your fire with your warmed wine and your illuminated manuscript, and your chessboard laid out on the table, and somewhere outside the gate someone is knocking. A travelling knight from the next county, who has every social right to expect shelter tonight, and you are calculating the mathematics of medieval courtesy against the mathematics of survival, and the answer is not simple. The chessboard gleams in the candlelight. You make a move. Then you pour another cup of wine and you try very hard not to think about who knocked. When the plague arrives in your city and regular physicians begin developing urgent reasons to relocate to their country properties, a new figure starts appearing in the streets, the plague doctor. You may have seen one by now. The long dark robe, oiled or waxed to resist contamination, down to the ankles, the wide-brimmed hat, the gloves, and the mask, the famous beak, shaped like a bird's face and extending a full foot in front of the wearer's nose, stuffed tightly with aromatic herbs and flowers and spices, roses, lavender, camphor, myrrh, mint, cloves, ambergris, dried citrus peel. The beak was designed to filter out the miasma, the bad air believed to cause plague, before it reached the doctor's lungs. It looked extraordinary. It looked like something from a fever dream. In some ways it was. City governments across Italy and southern France began hiring plague doctors, sometimes recruiting them from other cities, sometimes compelling local physicians to serve under threat of penalty, to examine the sick, confirm plague deaths, advise on isolation measures, and provide some form of official medical presence during a crisis that is rapidly overwhelming normal civic function. A plague doctor was a public servant in the most literal sense, a person paid to stand near death on behalf of a community. Some of them were experienced physicians, some were new graduates, some were, frankly, whoever was available and willing, because experienced physicians were often the first to leave. The quality varied enormously. Wealthy private citizens could also hire plague doctors for personal household attendance. This was expensive. These men knew their value in a market where supply was limited and demand was terrifying, and it bought you something that modern people might find frustratingly difficult to define. It did not buy you effective medical treatment. The plague doctor's actual interventions, fumigating the sick room with aromatic smoke, lancing buboes, applying poultices of butter and onion and dried figs, recommending bloodletting, adjusting the patient's diet, were based entirely on miasma theory and humoral medicine, both of which had nothing useful to say about a bacterial infection spread by fleas. In terms of changing the outcome of established plague, the plague doctor's medicine was essentially decorative. What you were buying, in the plainest terms, was documentation and presence. The plague doctor examined your sick household member and confirmed the diagnosis, which mattered for official purposes, for the death records the city was keeping with increasing urgency, for the quarantine measures being attempted at civic level, for the administration of last rites and the practical questions of inheritance that followed death. He was a professional witness to what was happening in your household, and in a world where legal and social status depended on proper documentation, that witnessing had value. You were also buying, less tangibly but genuinely, the psychological comfort of a professional response. The beak mask and the dark robes and the long cane the plague doctor used to examine patients from a distance, all of it communicated that someone was taking your crisis seriously, applying something that looked like organised knowledge to it, not simply leaving you alone with your prayers and your panic. This was not nothing. In a situation of pure helplessness, the presence of structured authority, even ineffective structured authority, provided a form of relief that was real in human terms if not in medical ones. And here is the accidental footnote to the whole arrangement. The beak mask packed with aromatic compounds, the waxed robe, the gloves, these provided a degree of physical barrier against respiratory transmission and direct contact that the wearer did not understand and could not have articulated, but that was, quietly, slightly useful. The plague doctors who survived in large numbers were not surviving because their herbs were fighting bacteria. They were surviving partly because their costume accidentally created some physical separation between them and the worst of the exposure. The 14th century occasionally got lucky. It did not get lucky often enough. Let's talk about the single most effective tool available to a wealthy person in a plague year. And no, it is not medicine, not prayer, not aromatic herbs, not a university-trained physician with impressive Latin. It is space. Physical, deliberate, enforced distance between yourself and the outside world. The concept was being developed in real time across the Italian city-states as the plague arrived. Venice and Ragusa among the first to require arriving ships to anchor offshore for a set period before being permitted to dock, a measure whose name, quarantine, comes from the Italian quarantina giorni, meaning 40 days. The number 40 was chosen for its biblical resonance, which tells you something about how 14th century public health policy was being developed. Part empirical observation, part scripture, part desperate improvisation. Wealthy households had the resources to attempt something equivalent on land. Close the gate, stop admitting visitors, suspend deliveries, turn away any servant or worker who had been in town recently, draw on stored provisions, reduce the household to its sealed-in members and wait out the crisis. This required several things that only wealth could provide. A substantial store of food and water that made self-sufficiency possible for weeks or months, a physical perimeter, wall, fence, gate, that could actually be enforced, enough internal space that the people sealed inside did not go entirely mad from confinement, and enough social authority that when you told your servants the gate was closed to outside traffic, they actually complied. Peasants could not do this. They lived in structures with no gates, often no walls, in villages so densely packed and socially interconnected that true isolation was physically impossible. They could not stockpile food because they barely had enough food for the present week. They could not stop working because stopping work meant stopping eating. The quarantine that wealthier households could attempt, imperfect, leaky, sometimes badly timed, was simply unavailable to most of the population, and this difference in access almost certainly accounts for some portion of the differential survival rates across economic classes. Almost certainly because disease history is complicated and the data is incomplete, and the plague was not exclusively a disease of poverty by any means. But wealth and isolation capacity were correlated in ways that mattered. The challenge was timing. The quarantine that worked was the quarantine implemented before the plague was inside the walls, before the servant who attended the market 4 days ago had started developing a fever, before the delivery that came through the gate last Tuesday had brought something invisible with it. And nobody in 1347 knew how to identify that threshold. There was no test, no confirmed case count, no official announcement that the plague had reached your specific neighbourhood. There was only rumour, then more rumour, then the specific terrible rumour that someone you knew had died of it, by which point it had almost certainly already been in your vicinity for days or weeks. The households that sealed successfully and survived did so because they happened to close their gates at the right moment, before the internal clock that nobody could read had already started ticking inside their walls. Some of them knew this. The luck of their timing was not lost on them, and the chronicles and personal letters of plague survivors contain passages of striking and uncomfortable honesty about the role that fortune played in their survival, alongside the measures they took. You lock your gate, you tell the door warden. No one enters without your personal instruction. You draw up a list of what is in the stores and how long it will last. You gather your household and explain, in terms that try to be reassuring without being dishonest, what you are doing and why. 40 people look back at you. 40 people who have been in and out of this gate for the past 3 weeks, going about their ordinary business in an ordinary world that was already unknown to any of them, not ordinary at all. The gate is locked. You're inside. Now you wait, and you count, and you watch everyone's face very carefully in the mornings. Here is something the chronicles and medical texts do not quite capture, but the literature absolutely does. The emotional experience of being wealthy during the Black Death was its own particular flavour of suffering. Not worse than the peasant experience. The peasant experience was, by every observable and quantifiable measure, categorically harder, but unique, in the way that the destruction of a specific kind of illusion is unique. Because wealth, in ordinary life, is the illusion of control made material. It is the ability to solve problems with resources, to manage discomfort through expenditure, to arrange the world into a more acceptable configuration by deploying the tools that money provides. A cold room, more firewood, a bad harvest. Buy grain from elsewhere. An illness, hire the physician. Wealth in medieval Europe was not omnipotent, but it was meaningfully effective against most of the problems a 14th century life presented, and this had been true long enough that it had settled into an expectation, a background assumption about how things worked. The plague destroyed this assumption with a thoroughness that must have been genuinely disorienting, because you tried everything. Not carelessly, not half-heartedly. You tried with the full resources of a wealthy medieval household, which means you tried harder and more expensively than most people on Earth had any ability to try. You hired the physician and followed his dietary recommendations. You burned the aromatic woods, fumigated the rooms, sealed the windows against bad air. You had the priest say masses every morning and extra masses on particularly anxious afternoons. You wore the pomander and changed your linen and moved the household to the country estate and locked the gate and rationed the stores and did everything that the best available knowledge of the 14th century recommended, and then someone got sick anyway. This is the moment Boccaccio describes with extraordinary precision the fracturing of the social and psychological order that the plague produced in the wealthy. He describes people abandoning their families, fleeing from their own households at the first sign of illness, leaving sick relatives in rooms alone because the terror of proximity overrode every social obligation they had held. He describes this not as the behaviour of monsters, but as the behaviour of people whose frameworks had broken, people who had structured their entire lives around the idea that the right combination of resources and actions could produce safety, discovering that this was not true. The responses split in ways that feel recognisable across centuries. Some people became more rigid, more obsessive, more controlling, doubling down on every measure, rationing more strictly, praying more hours, refusing all contact, living in a state of concentrated vigilance that was in some ways its own kind of suffering. Others, Boccaccio's other camp, went entirely the other direction. If death was coming regardless, then the feast tonight mattered more than the locked gate. Eat well, drink deeply, sing loudly, and meet the end with a full cup rather than an empty one. Medieval taverns and private households alike saw this response, the ferocious appetite for pleasure in the face of uncontrollable danger. Most people, probably, move between both positions depending on the day, the news, the state of the person in the next room. Rigid control in the morning, a cup of wine that became several cups of wine by evening, prayers at midnight that were half genuinely devotional and half bargaining out loud with a God who had stopped responding in any legible way. You're sitting in your great hall right now, fire burning, wine in your hand, listening to your household musician play something quiet and familiar. It is a good evening by the standards of this particular year. Nobody is sick tonight. The gate is locked. The stores are full. You drain your cup and hold it out to be refilled. Tomorrow you will be disciplined again. Tonight you are a person in 1347, and the candles are bright, and the wine is warm, and outside the walls the world is doing what it is doing, and none of that is something you can change before morning. Let's talk about plague prevention, wealthy addition, because the 14th century had strong and confident opinions about this, and money meant you could act on all of them simultaneously and at considerable expense. The dominant medical theory was miasma, the idea that plague spread through corrupted air that carried some invisible pestilential quality from decaying matter, standing water, unburied bodies, the exhalations of the sick. This theory was wrong in its mechanism. The plague was bacterial, spread by flea bites, not by air, but it was the reigning framework of every university-trained physician in Europe, endorsed by the most respected medical authorities of the age, and it informed every preventative measure that money could buy. You burned aromatic woods in your rooms. Juniper, rosemary, pine fed into braziers and fireplaces throughout the day, filling your manor with fragrant smoke that was meant to displace or neutralize the corrupt air outside. The smell was genuinely pleasant, which may have contributed to the conviction that it was working. Medieval wealthy households in plague years smelled, according to contemporary accounts, powerfully of burned herbs and incense, a constant low haze of aromatic smoke that was simultaneously a medical precaution and an accidental fumigation program for the insects in your floor rushes. You carried a pomander. These were small spherical containers made from gold or silver or pierced ivory for the wealthy and simple clay, or carved wood for those with less to spend, filled with a compound called a pomander paste. Ambergris, musk, cloves, rose, civet, and other aromatic substances blended together into a waxy ball. You held it to your nose when you had to pass through spaces you considered dangerous, the street, the market, any area near the sick or the dead. The scent was intense, sweet, heavy, designed to overwhelm the corrupted air before it reached your lungs. Wealthier pomanders were worn on chains around the neck or waist, displayed as both protective amulet and status symbol. You could, in theory, walk through a plague-infected neighbourhood breathing nothing but ambergris and cloves, which would not protect you from flea bites, but might give you a migraine. You had sachets of herbs sewn into your clothing, dried lavender, rue, wormwood, and other strong-scented plants tucked into the hems and seams of your garments, releasing their scent as you move through the day. Your linen was scented with herbs before being stored. Your floors were strewn with aromatic rushes changed more frequently than usual. Your chapel burned incense almost continuously. Your manor, at its peak of plague prevention activity, was essentially one large slow-release aromatic device, functioning at considerable expense and with tremendous confidence. Here is the irony, and it is genuinely one of history's better accidental footnotes. Some of these measures had a minor real effect, for reasons nobody understood. Certain aromatic compounds, lavender in particular, have documented insect-repelling properties. Strongly scented floors and clothing may have slightly discouraged fleas from their habitual activities. Smoke in rooms reduced the flea population modestly. The wealthy, by fumigating their spaces and scenting their bodies with herb compounds, were incidentally doing something faintly useful, not for the reasons they believed, not through the mechanism they hypothesized, but because the same properties that made the herbs smell interesting to humans made them mildly inhospitable to the arthropod that was actually causing the problem. They were doing the right thing for the entirely wrong reason. This is, in the history of public health, almost unprecedented. You pin on your pomander, tuck your herb sachets into your sleeve, instruct the servants to add more juniper to the brazier, and walk through your manor trailing a personal cloud of 14th century preventive medicine, completely wrong in theory and occasionally right in practice, and smelling, whatever the circumstances, absolutely extraordinary. Let's talk about what you were eating to stay healthy, because medieval medical theory had very specific ideas about plague prevention diet, and being wealthy meant you could follow those ideas with impressive precision and at impressive cost. The physicians of the 14th century, working from humoral theory, identified certain foods as dangerous in plague times, foods considered cold and moist in their humoral qualities, which were believed to make the body more receptive to the pestilential air. Cucumbers were out. Raw fruit was suspect. Fish, particularly freshwater fish, was considered risky because of its cold, moist nature. Salads were discouraged. Anything that might increase the body's internal moisture and thereby open it to corruption was approached with caution. The recommended foods, by contrast, were warm and dry. Roasted meats, particularly of birds and young animals, which were considered more digestible and warming. Eggs cooked firmly, white bread, well baked. White, soups and broths made with warming spices, almonds, hard cheese, and everywhere, deeply and repeatedly, spices. Ginger, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, pepper, the imported spices that cost fortunes and lived in locked boxes in wealthy pantries, were medically recommended in plague times as fortifying the body's internal warmth and protecting it against external corruption. Your physician prescribed them. Your cook used them. You ate a heavily spiced diet with the moral satisfaction of someone following doctor's orders. This was, nutritionally speaking, not terrible advice, separate from the entirely wrong reasoning behind it. A diet heavy in roasted protein, complex carbohydrates, and a variety of spices is a reasonable diet. Avoiding raw fruit and vegetables in a world without food safety standards was, in some circumstances, genuinely prudent. Not because of humoral moisture, but because of the very real risk of consuming produce washed in or grown near contaminated water. The medieval physician was wrong about the mechanism and accidentally pointing toward a real risk, which is a pattern that appears repeatedly in 14th century medicine and never gets less strange. The spiced wine your physician recommended, warm, honeyed, flavoured with cinnamon and ginger, was called hippocras, and it was one of the genuine pleasures of wealthy medieval life disguised as medicine. You drank it for your health, your physician approved it for your health, and it was delicious, which created a virtuous alignment of the enjoyable and the professionally endorsed that was rare enough in the 14th century to be savoured alongside the wine itself. Wine in general was considered safer than water, which, for the reasons we have already discussed, it frequently was, and moderate wine consumption was actively recommended by medical authorities. This was the one recommendation of 14th century medicine that history has evaluated with something approaching sympathy. Eating at a wealthy medieval table during a plague year was an experience of genuine sensory richness. The variety of dishes, the quality of the spicing, the theatre of the service, a wealthy feast was a carefully orchestrated performance of abundance, warmth, and civilized order. Everything the plague was not. The table offered temporarily the reassurance of continuity, life as it had been, food as it had been, the rituals of eating that said the world was still functioning on familiar terms. You ate your roasted pheasant with ginger sauce and your white bread, and your spiced almonds and your warmed hippocras, and it was good. Genuinely, meaningfully good. Better food than most people on earth were eating. Prepared with skill and served with care, flavoured with spices that had travelled from the other side of the world to reach your table. None of it was going to protect you from a flea, but it was a very good meal. And in 1347, a very good meal was not nothing. It was warmth and flavour and the company of people you cared about, eating together at a table that was still set. That was, in the circumstances, worth something. You held out your cup for more hippocras. Your cook had put extra cinnamon in tonight's batch. It was excellent. Let's talk about what the wealthy did with guilt, because in the 14th century, guilt was not simply an emotional experience. It was a theological category with a price list attached. Medieval Christianity had developed over centuries an extraordinarily detailed and internally consistent framework for the relationship between sin, suffering, and salvation. Plague was interpreted almost universally by clergy and laity alike as divine punishment, God's wrath visited on humanity for the accumulated weight of its sins. This was not fringe theology. This was the mainstream explanation endorsed by bishops, preached from pulpits, and accepted by kings. If the plague was God's punishment, then what the wealthy could do, what their resources specifically enabled, was make the most expensive and comprehensive possible act of collective contrition. Churches and monasteries received an extraordinary influx of donations during plague years that is documented in the financial records that survive. Wealthy patrons funded the construction and endowment of chantry chapels, dedicated spaces within churches where a hired priest or several would say masses specifically and continuously for the donor's soul and the souls of their designated family members. This was spiritual insurance at its most explicit. Pay now, receive ongoing prayer indefinitely, improve your odds in purgatory. The going rate for a chantry endowment was substantial, and demand during the plague years was exceptional. Illuminated manuscripts were commissioned, books of hours particularly, the devotional texts that structured daily prayer in beautiful and expensive detail. You did not commission an illuminated book of hours casually. You commissioned it as a statement of piety, of intent, of your seriousness about the afterlife at a moment when the afterlife had become urgently relevant. The manuscripts that survive from this period often show evidence of being ordered in haste, completed in grief, given as memorials to specific individuals who died before the book was finished. Wills were revised with extraordinary frequency. The medieval will was not primarily a legal document in the modern sense. It was a spiritual instrument, a final accounting of your obligations to God, to the church, to the poor, to the souls of your ancestors, and to the people you were leaving behind. Plague survivors described the urgency of will-making in their chronicles with a specificity that communicates genuine panic. People dictating new wills from sickbeds, revising provisions daily as circumstances changed, settling old debts, and forgiven old grievances with the thoroughness that ordinary life had never prompted. Donations to hospitals, to leper houses, to religious foundations, to the repair of churches and the feeding of the poor, all spiked during plague years in ways that the surviving financial records document clearly. Whether this was genuine spiritual transformation, elaborate negotiation with an uncertain afterlife, or some combination of both that varied by individual and by day, is a question the 14th century answers differently, depending on which document you read and which writer you trust. Some wealthy people joined the flagellant movement, the groups of roving penitents who beat themselves publicly as acts of contrition. This required abandoning your household, your estate, your title, and your comfort to march through the countryside in a white robe whipping yourself, which was a significant departure from wealthy medieval norms. The movement drew members across the social spectrum, but a wealthy person joining it was making a statement about desperation, about the failure of the usual frameworks, about the willingness to seek absolution through physical suffering when every other avenue felt insufficient. You have been to your private chapel twice today. Your priest has said 3 masses. You've added a substantial donation to the cathedral's construction fund to the list of things your steward is managing. You have revised your will. You have prayed with a sincerity and a volume that would have seemed excessive 3 months ago. Outside, the bells are ringing again. You fold your hands and start again from the beginning. Let's talk about the moment. Because there would have been a specific, unavoidable, unforgettable moment when the plague stopped being something that was happening somewhere else, to other people, in other cities, in the lower quarters of your town, and became something that was happening here, in this house, to someone you knew by name. You will have heard the general news before this. You will have known for weeks or months that the plague was moving, that it had reached the nearest city, that households in the nearest town were affected. You will have received the reports with the combination of genuine fear and psychological distance that humans apply to terrible things that have not yet arrived at their specific address. And then one morning your steward knocks on the door of your solar with a face that tells you before he says a word. Maybe it was a kitchen boy, young and strong, who came to work looking grey and wrong, glassy-eyed, stumbling against the doorframe. Maybe it was your laundress who had been slightly off yesterday but had said nothing, and this morning could not get up from her pallet. Maybe it was someone whose face you knew so well it seemed impossible to be looking at it in this new and terrible light. The plague arrived not as a distant statistic or a rumoured catastrophe, but as a person you recognised, in a room you walk through every day, looking at you with eyes that were already somewhere else. The bubo, the swollen lymph node that was the plague's signature mark, appeared typically in the groin, the armpit or the neck, hard and painful and darkening at the edges, sometimes growing to the size of an apple within hours. Contemporaries described it with a specificity that leaves no doubt they were trying to get the information right, to record exactly what it looked like so that it could be recognised and responded to. They were trying to understand something that was killing them faster than understanding arrived. Your physician comes, eventually, with the distance and the grave manner and the long cane he now uses to examine patients rather than touching them. He looks at the bubo from across the room. He consults his charts. He confirms what you already knew the moment you saw your kitchen boy's face in the doorframe. He recommends fumigation of the sick room, isolation of the patient, dietary restriction, possibly bloodletting if the patient's strength permits. He will return tomorrow, he says, unless circumstances. He leaves this phrase carefully unfinished and picks up his bag, and leaves with rather more haste than he arrived with. You stand in the corridor outside the sick room and you conduct, in the space of perhaps 30 seconds, a rapid and silent accounting of everything that has happened in the past 2 weeks. Who has been where? Who handled what? Who sat next to whom at meals? Who shared a cup, a task, a room? The incubation period of plague, which you do not know in those terms but which you are feeling your way toward through pure dread, means that if one person in your household is sick today, several more are already infected and do not know it yet. The gate is locked. The physician has left. The sick room is being fumigated with juniper smoke by a servant who has been told, in the most careful terms you could manage, that this is a necessary precaution and not a reason for panic. You have every material resource the 14th century offers. You have all of it, deployed as effectively as the 14th century allows. And standing in the corridor, listening to the sound of someone in pain behind a closed door, none of it feels like enough. It is not enough. That is the thing you are only now fully understanding. It was never enough. Let's talk about dying, which in the 14th century was practically universal and practically unavoidable, and happened, on average, at ages that modern people would consider early middle age. The Black Death killed. The estimates range from 30 to 60% of Europe's total population across the years of the first wave alone, and the number is so large that it has a numbing quality, a scale at which the human mind reaches its capacity for comprehension and just stops. Between 1347 and 1351, somewhere between 25 and 50 million people died across Europe and the Middle East. This is not a statistic that lands cleanly. It is a fact that requires sitting with, in the dark after the lights are off, to begin to feel the actual weight of. It killed across all categories. It killed kings. Alfonso XI of Castile died of plague in 1350 while besieging Gibraltar. It killed bishops and archbishops. It killed the scholarly, the devout, the careful, and the dissolute in proportions that matched each other closely enough to make the whole idea of divine selectivity look very shaky indeed. It killed the filthy and the clean, the well-fed and the starving, those with physicians and those with none. The gap between the wealthy and the poor in terms of raw mortality is there in the historical record, but it is not a chasm. It is a modest statistical gradient in the face of something that was fundamentally not interested in social hierarchy. And yet the experience of dying was profoundly different across economic lines. Not the fact of it, the context of it. A wealthy person dying of plague had their own room, not the communal sick room of a hospital or the shared pallet of a peasant household, but their own space, with their own belongings, with people who knew their name and their history present at the bedside. Their physician came, however useless his interventions. Their priest came, which was not a small thing. The rites of the church, the last confession, the anointing, the final absolution, were matters of profound importance in a world where the soul's fate after death was a literal and urgent question, not a metaphorical comfort. Dying without last rites meant dying with your sins unresolved and your soul's trajectory uncertain, and this was a terror that the medieval mind held with a seriousness that is difficult to fully convey to the modern reader. A wealthy person had a coffin. This sounds almost too simple to mention, but in the context of the Black Death it is not simple at all. Cities across Europe ran out of coffins within weeks of the plague's arrival. Bodies were being buried in mass graves, the fosse commune, the great pits dug outside city walls, wrapped in sheets when sheets were available and sometimes not even that. The demand for burial space exceeded the capacity of every churchyard in every affected city so rapidly that new burial grounds had to be consecrated in haste, in fields and gardens and whatever open ground was available. A wealthy person could still, in the early stages of an outbreak, be buried in consecrated ground with a marked grave and recorded prayers, their death documented, their passing acknowledged. The poor died and were collected. They were numbered sometimes in the records that survive. The death toll tallies that chroniclers kept with increasing desperation as the numbers mounted past any previous framework for counting the dead. But they were not named. They were not marked. They went into the pits, and the pits were covered, and that was all. Wealth did not prevent death. It shaped the shape of dying, the company, the ceremony, the documentation, the after. Whether this mattered is a question that depends on what you believe about what matters. To the 14th century, it mattered enormously. The ceremony of death was not decoration. It was the structure of meaning laid around the most meaning-destroying thing that existed. You would die if the plague reached you, in your own bed, in your own room, with your name on a record and a priest at your side and a coffin measured to your body. This was what money could still buy. It was both everything and nothing at all. Let's talk about children, because this is where the emotional weight of wealth during the Black Death becomes something that the ledgers and chronicles and medical texts struggle to contain. You had resources. You had everything the 14th century could offer in the direction of protecting a child. The best available food, the warmest and driest rooms in the house, clean linen changed regularly, a physician available, servants dedicated to their care, isolation from the crowded public spaces where transmission was greatest. You could give a child in your household conditions that were, by the standards of the century, extraordinarily protected. Most children in the 14th century lived in conditions that we would today consider acutely dangerous. Your children did not. Your children had a nurse, a tutor, a cook preparing food specifically calibrated to their dietary needs according to the best available medical advice, and parents with enough resources to respond immediately to any sign of illness. None of this was nothing. The survival advantages conferred by wealth on children in normal times were real and measurable. Wealthy children survived infancy at higher rates than poor ones. They survived childhood illnesses, malnutrition-related conditions, and the general attrition of medieval childhood in better proportion. They had enough food. They had warmth. They had medical attention when they were sick. These things mattered in ordinary years in ways that showed up in the demographics. The plague was not an ordinary year. The Black Death killed children, not at the same rate as adults, according to some studies of surviving skeletal evidence, but at rates that devastated communities that had grown accustomed to losing a certain number of children and had never prepared themselves to lose so many adults. And wealthy children, for all their protected circumstances, were still children of the 14th century, which meant they shared their household with servants who went to market, with animals that carried fleas, with floors that harboured rats, with a world that did not yet know that the thing killing everyone was moving through insects on the backs of rodents in the grain stores. Medieval parents loved their children with an intensity that later historians sometimes underestimated. There was a lazy assumption in early historical scholarship that high child mortality produced emotional distance, a protective numbness. A medieval parent who did not attach too deeply, because attachment was too expensive in a world where children died so often. The actual sources disagree with this characterization in a way that is almost aggressive. The wills drawn up by parents during plague years, the donations made to churches in memory of dead children, the personal letters that survive, these are not the documents of people who had made their peace in advance. The grief in them is not managed. It is raw and specific and named. Your physician has no treatment for a child with plague that differs meaningfully from his treatment for an adult. He will recommend the same diet, the same fumigation, the same anxious distance. Your priest will come and say the same prayers. Your household will watch and wait and perform the same rituals of care, sponging the fever, changing the linens, sitting through the night that medieval nursing consisted of, which was almost entirely presence and almost nothing else. Wealth made the grief quieter, perhaps. It meant the death was documented and marked and remembered in stone. It did not make the child safer, not in the end. It did not make the space beside you less empty in the weeks after. It did not give the priest's words more weight than they carried for every other parent, in every other room, across a continent that was learning what it meant to lose everyone. You would do everything money could do. You would do it completely and without hesitation. And then you would sit with the fact that everything money could do was not the thing that mattered most. That is the specific grief of wealth in a plague year. Knowing the limits of your power at the exact moment when power was the thing you most needed to have. Let's talk about what happened to money when a third of Europe died, because this is one of the stranger, grimmer, and occasionally almost accidentally hopeful stories to emerge from the Black Death. Medieval Europe's economy was built on a feudal system that had been remarkably stable for centuries. Lords owned land, serfs and peasants worked it. The labour supply was abundant, and because it was abundant, it was cheap. If a worker died or left or became difficult, there were always more workers. The system was not kind, but it was, from the perspective of the people at the top of it, extremely functional. It had been functional for so long that most wealthy people had stopped thinking of it as a system at all. It was simply the way things were, the natural order, the arrangement that God had apparently endorsed by allowing it to persist. The plague did not negotiate with this arrangement. It reduced the labour supply of Europe by somewhere between a third and a half in a period of years, which in economic terms was an event so extreme that the existing framework simply could not process it. Suddenly there were vastly fewer workers, and the workers who survived found themselves in a position they had never occupied before. They were scarce. Scarcity in any market is power. The peasant who had previously accepted whatever wage the lord offered, because the alternative was to be replaced by the next desperate man in line, now found that the next desperate man in line was dead. Several of them were dead. The lord had fields that needed working and nobody to work them, and the next village over had the same problem, and the village after that as well. Wages rose, in some regions dramatically, in others more modestly, but the direction was consistent and the trend was real. The cost of agricultural labour in England roughly doubled in the years following the first wave of plague. Skilled tradespeople, blacksmiths, carpenters, masons, craftsmen of every variety, found their services commanding prices that would have been unimaginable before 1347. Rents fell as lords competed for the tenants who remained. Land that had been intensively farmed now sat partially idle, because there were not enough people to work all of it, which made the surviving land more productive and its workers more valuable. The wealthy watched this with undisguised alarm. Parliament in England passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351, attempting to legally cap wages at pre-plague levels and compel workers to accept the old terms. France passed similar legislation. These laws were, in the long run, largely unenforceable. You cannot legislate supply into existence. But they tell you everything about how the surviving wealthy experienced the economic aftermath of the plague. They experienced it as a threat, as an overturning of a natural order that they had assumed was permanent. The serfs and the peasants who survived experienced it differently. Not uniformly, not immediately, not without continued suffering and exploitation. The feudal system did not collapse overnight, and the wealthy did not surrender their advantages without legal, social, and sometimes violent resistance. But the leverage had shifted. The peasant who walked away from one lord's land to accept better terms from a competing lord was doing something that would have been practically impossible before 1347. The Black Death, which took so much, gave something back to the people at the bottom of the medieval economy, a degree of negotiating power that the structure of the old world had been specifically designed to prevent them from ever having. Your estates need workers. The workers you have know it. The steward brings you the new wage demands this morning with a face that expects you to be angry. You are angry. You are also quietly aware that you have no alternative. You sign the revised accounts. The world after the plague is not the world before it. Not for anyone, not even for you. Let's talk about something dark, because the Black Death did not only kill, it also revealed with terrible clarity what fear does to human communities when the fear becomes large enough and the explanations run out. This is history that requires care, honesty, and no softening. When the plague arrived in Europe and began killing at rates that no existing framework could explain, the need for an explanation became desperate. Miasma theory was offered. Astrological alignment was offered. Divine punishment was offered. And then, spreading through Germany and France and Switzerland with a speed that tracked the plague itself, another explanation was offered, one that located the cause not in bad air or planetary position or collective sin, but in human agency, specifically in a conspiracy. The accusation was that Jewish communities were poisoning wells. It was completely false. It was demonstrably false even by the standards of the 14th century. Jewish people were dying of the plague too, at rates that, while possibly somewhat lower in some communities due to certain religious practices around cleanliness and food preparation, were still catastrophic. Pope Clement VI issued a papal bull explicitly and clearly stating that Jewish people were not responsible for the plague, that the accusation was false, and that attacking them was a sin. Several secular authorities made similar statements. The logic of the accusation fell apart under any examination. If the wells were poisoned, why were Jews dying too? Why were areas without Jewish communities equally devastated? None of this stopped the massacres. In Strasbourg, in February of 1349, approximately 900 Jewish people were burned alive on a wooden platform in the Jewish cemetery, before the plague had even reached the city. The city council that ordered the massacre was subsequently replaced by one more willing to proceed with killing, because the old council had tried to intervene in Mainz, in Cologne, in Frankfurt, in hundreds of towns across the Holy Roman Empire. Jewish communities were attacked, expelled, or murdered. Some communities, knowing what was coming, chose to set their own buildings on fire rather than face what the mobs were bringing. The Basel community was burned alive in a specially constructed wooden building on an island in the Rhine. These are not abstractions. These were people, named people, with families and trades and histories killed by their neighbours in a paroxysm of fear and hatred dressed as explanation. The role of the wealthy in this horror was not uniform and not simple. Some wealthy Christians, citizens and authorities protected their Jewish neighbours, motivated by genuine moral conviction, by economic relationships of mutual dependency, or by the papal condemnation of the violence. Some wealthy citizens participated in or enabled the attacks, motivated by the opportunity to cancel debts owed to Jewish lenders, or simply by the same fear and hatred driving the mobs. The wealthy had more power to stop the violence than the poor and used it inconsistently, which is the specific moral failure of people with power in a crisis. What happened to Jewish communities during the Black Death was not an aberration in an otherwise tolerant medieval Europe. It was an intensification of persecution that had been continuous for centuries, of legal exclusions and restrictions and expulsions and violence that had been the background condition of Jewish life in Christian Europe for generations. The plague made it worse, catastrophically, historically, irreparably worse in many communities. And the conspiracy theory that drove it, unfounded, illogical, repeatedly condemned by authority, spread faster than anyone with the authority to stop it could manage, because fear in a plague year does not wait for evidence. This is the part of the Black Death that wealth could not separate you from if you were Jewish. It could, in some cases, buy temporary protection, influence, the shelter of a specific powerful individual willing to stand between a community and a mob. It could not buy safety in a system that had decided you were the explanation. The history of the plague is not complete without this. It is in some ways the most human part of it, the part that demonstrates most clearly what catastrophe does to the boundaries of the acceptable, and how quickly those boundaries can move. Let's talk about what came after, because surviving the Black Death was not simply a return to the life you had before. It was an emergence into a world that looked like the old world in its physical outlines. The same roads, the same stone churches, the same fields, the same manor houses, but that had been altered in ways that were not immediately visible and that would take years and decades to fully understand. If you were wealthy and you survived, you came out of your locked gate or returned from your country estate to a landscape that was quieter than the one you had left, in ways that quietness does not adequately describe. Not peaceful quiet, the quiet of absence, the quiet of a city that used to contain 30,000 people and now contained 18,000, and the mathematics of that reduction visible everywhere you looked, in the empty houses, the untended gardens, the fields gone to weed at the edges, the parish church conducting burial services for the last of the dead, with a priest who had himself just recovered and was conducting the service with hands that still shook. Your city had changed while you were away, or while you were sealed inside. The social fabric, the dense network of relationships, obligations, dependencies, and hierarchies that medieval urban life was built from, had been torn in ways that would require years to mend, and some of which would never fully mend. Half the people who had owed you service were dead. Half the people to whom you had owed service were dead. Estates that had been in families for generations were suddenly without heirs, or with distant heirs who had to be located and informed and brought to claim what was now theirs. The legal system was overwhelmed with probate, with inheritance disputes, with the tangled consequences of entire family lines being eliminated in weeks. The church that had been the bedrock of community life was visibly shaken. It had lost enormous numbers of clergy. The priests who had stayed and ministered to the dying were among the plague's most consistent victims, and had filled the resulting gaps hastily, sometimes poorly. The standards of the clergy in the decade after the Black Death were, by the Church's own later assessment, lower than before, and this contributed to a growing undercurrent of criticism of clerical behaviour and competence that would build over the following century into something the Church had not yet imagined and would not know how to stop. Art began to change in ways that were visible even within years of the plague's first wave. The danse macabre, the dance of death, the artistic motif showing death as a skeletal figure leading people of every social rank in an inevitable procession, appeared in frescoes, woodcuts, and manuscript illustrations across Europe in the decades after the plague. Skeletons, hourglasses, withered flowers, the memento mori imagery that reminded the viewer of their mortality, became a dominant strand in European art, reflecting a society that had been forced to look at death directly and could not quite look away again. The wealthy commissioned this art. They put death imagery in their chapels and their private books. They wanted to remember, or perhaps they needed to, as if forgetting was a danger they could not risk. Your wealth survived. The chest in your undercroft still held silver. Your land was still yours, and in some cases more than it had been, as adjacent properties without surviving heirs came into your management. You were, in the purely material accounting of the thing, possibly richer than before the plague, in the way that survivors of a catastrophe that kills competitors and leaves assets unclaimed sometimes are. And yet you stood in your great hall, which was emptier than it used to be, and looked out at a world that was wearing the face of the old world over something that was not the old world at all, and you understood, in the particular way that only survivors of something enormous can understand, that the before and after were not the same place. They had the same name. They were not the same place. Let's talk about the flagellants, because this is the 14th century's most spectacular collective response to the plague, and it deserves to be understood not as an act of medieval madness, but as a human response to an event so large and so inexplicable that the available frameworks genuinely could not contain it. The flagellant movement, the Brethren of the Cross, as they called themselves, emerged primarily in the German-speaking lands in 1349, when the plague was at or near its peak in Central Europe, and the theological explanation of divine punishment had been under catastrophic pressure for 2 years. If this was punishment for sin, then repentance was the response. And if ordinary repentance, confession, prayer, fasting, donation, was insufficient to the scale of the offence, then the repentance would need to be extraordinary. The flagellants travelled in groups of 50 to several hundred, sometimes more. They wore white robes marked with red crosses, the colour of martyrdom and sacrifice, and they moved from town to town in formal processions, singing hymns as they walked. Twice each day in public they performed their ritual, stripping to the waist, lying face down in a circle, and beating themselves with leather straps tipped with iron spikes or metal studs, rising and continuing the beating as they walked, blood running down their backs while onlookers crowded the streets to watch, and sometimes wept, and sometimes joined. The ritual was choreographed and specific. The number of strokes, the prayers said, the postures assumed. Not chaotic self-destruction, but organised penitential theatre, designed to be witnessed, to communicate the seriousness of the contrition being offered. In towns along the Rhine, in Austria, in Bohemia, flagellant processions were met with enormous crowds. People threw themselves on the ground before them. Women tried to touch the blood-soaked robes, believing the blood had sanctifying power. Town clergy rang bells and turned out with candles to receive them. The movement had the quality of a revival, the desperate collective energy of people looking for something that worked, something that matched the scale of the disaster they were living through, when the ordinary measures had so visibly failed. And here is the part that matters for this particular story. Wealthy people joined. Not only the desperate poor, not only the people for whom the plague had taken everything and left nothing to lose. People of means, of status, of education, people with estates and titles and physicians on retainer, stripped off their fine wool and put on white linen, and walked with the flagellants and bled publicly in town squares. The movement explicitly required participants to surrender their ordinary identity for the period of their participation, to live communally, to give away their money for the duration, to exist as penitents rather than as the social categories they normally occupied. Wealthy participants were making a more dramatic departure from their normal lives than poor ones. They were choosing it anyway. Pope Clement VI condemned the flagellant movement in October of 1349, declaring it heretical on several grounds. The flagellants had begun to claim that their self-punishment could replace the Church's sacraments, that their blood was equal in redemptive power to Christ's, that confession to a priest was unnecessary for members of their order. This was a direct challenge to clerical authority at exactly the moment when clerical authority was already fragile, and the Church moved to suppress it with a combination of official condemnation and civil enforcement. The movement declined rapidly after the papal condemnation, its leadership scattered, its followers absorbed back into ordinary life. But for the months of its height, the processions moving through burning summer towns while the death carts rolled in the other direction, the flagellant movement was something that the 14th century produced, and nothing else has quite produced since. The spectacle of an entire civilization trying to outrun its own suffering through the only language it had left, which was pain. The wealthy who joined came home afterward, if they survived both the plague and the flagellant journey, to their manor houses and their locked chests and their tapestried walls. They came home different. Not all of them could have told you precisely how, but the person who kneels in a town square and bleeds in public beside strangers is not the same person who rode out of a stone gate in fine wool a season ago. Something had shifted in the accounting of what mattered, what that shift eventually produced in their estates, their wills, their relationships with their tenants, their sense of what the world owed them and what they owed the world, is the quiet aftermath that the chronicles do not always record, but that the decades following the plague make visible in aggregate. The world had broken open, even the wealthy had felt the draft. Let's talk about legacy, which is where the wealthy always have the last word, not because their perspective is more true or more important, but because they had the resources to make records, to commission art, to endow institutions, to build the physical structures that carried meaning forward across time. The survivors of the Black Death among the wealthy classes left behind wills and chronicles and foundations and buildings that form a substantial portion of what we know about this period, and reading those documents now is to read the testimony of people who'd been through something they could not fully describe, and were trying, with every tool money could buy, to make something lasting out of what remained. The art of the decades immediately following the plague is among the most remarkable in European history, precisely because it is art made by people who had recently seen death at a scale that art had never previously been asked to absorb. The great memorial chapels funded by wealthy survivors were not simply acts of piety. They were acts of reckoning, physical structures built to hold grief and give it somewhere to go, to assert that the people who died had existed and mattered and were not simply numbers in the death toll tallies that chroniclers kept with increasing desperation as the first wave rolled through. The extraordinary illuminated manuscript commissioned by the Duc de Berry in the early 15th century is in part the product of a world remade by the plague, a world that had looked at death so closely it needed, urgently, to look at beauty with equal intensity. The wealthy survivor found themselves in many cases materially richer than before. Inherited estates, consolidated land, the vacuum left by entire family lines eliminated. These things accumulated in the hands of whoever remained, and the 14th century had no machinery for redistributing them. If you survived and your neighbour died without heirs, your neighbour's land was yours or your lord's, and either way the wealth moved upward toward the people already positioned to receive it. This is the grim arithmetic of survival, that the historical record documents without judgment, because the historical record does not do judgment, it does inventory. But the wealthy survivor also found themselves in a world whose certainties had been visibly, permanently damaged. The church that had been the organisational spine of daily life was shaken, and would not fully recover its previous authority before it was challenged by forces the plague had indirectly set in motion. The questioning of clerical competence, the demand for vernacular access to scripture, the theological restlessness that the plague had stirred and that the following century would feed, the feudal system that had seemed as natural and permanent as the seasons had been shown to be contingent, dependent on a labour supply that could be catastrophically reduced, adjustable in ways the people at the top of it had believed were impossible. The confidence of the wealthy, the specific, embodied confidence of people for whom the world had been reliably arranged in their favour, had a crack in it that had not been there before 1347. The wealthy built churches and funded hospitals and endowed chantries and wrote chronicles because this is what people with resources do in the face of the uncontrollable. They make things, they record things, they attempt to impose permanence on a world that has demonstrated its impermanence with catastrophic specificity. They try to build meaning into the aftermath. Some of what they built is still standing. The hospitals they funded continue to serve the sick. The art they commissioned continued to show people beauty in a world that needed it. The chronicles they kept or commissioned are the closest thing we have to testimony from the inside of the event. And yet, the most honest legacies of the wealthy Black Death survivors are not the buildings or the art or the chronicles. They are the small personal documents, the wills revised in haste, the letters written to people who were already dead by the time the letter arrived, the accounts of households trying to function after losing half their members, that show, without ceremony or architecture, what it actually felt like to be a person with every material advantage the 14th century offered, standing in the ruins of the framework those advantages had always depended on. It felt like this. Your money was in the chest. The chest was still full. The world outside the chest had changed into something you did not entirely recognise, and the money, for all its weight and reality, could not change it back. You had survived. That was the legacy. You were here, and many were not, and the gap between those two states had been determined by a combination of your resources and your decisions and the pure blind luck of where a flea happened to jump one Tuesday morning in the autumn of 1347. You counted your silver. You unlocked your gate. You walked back out into the changed world, and you tried, as humans in every century have always tried, to make something of what was left. Let's talk about the rats, because no honest account of the Black Death is complete without a proper introduction to the animal that made the whole catastrophe possible, and which received almost none of the historical attention it deserved while it was busy dismantling European civilization. The black rat, Rattus rattus, to give it the scientific name it would not receive for several centuries, was not a newcomer to medieval Europe. It had been there for hundreds of years, arriving via trade routes from Asia, establishing itself in granaries and warehouses and ships and the walls of every stone building and the thatch of every wooden one, living in comfortable proximity to humans and their food supplies, with the easy confidence of a tenant who knows the landlord cannot actually make them leave. Medieval people knew rats were a problem. They kept cats specifically to manage them, and the medieval cat was not the pampered decorative creature of later centuries, lounging on velvet cushions and ignoring its responsibilities. It was a working animal, employed, fed and valued for its specific utility in the ongoing war against rodents. It was also, in the same way that all medieval pest management was, partially effective and ultimately insufficient. The rat population of a medieval manor, a medieval city, a medieval port was not a problem that cats solved. It was a problem that cats managed to a level that everyone agreed to call acceptable, because the alternative was despair. They set traps, wooden spring traps baited with grain, pit traps lined with grease, various devices that killed individual rats with satisfying efficiency and made no appreciable dent in the population. They used poison, arsenic compounds, plant-derived substances, mixtures whose recipes were passed through households and guilds as practical knowledge. They employed professional rat catchers in cities where the infestation was severe enough to justify the specialization, with men who moved through the streets with traps and dogs and a pragmatic relationship with death that their occupation required. None of it worked in any absolute sense. The rat population of medieval Europe was simply too large, too distributed, and too biologically productive to be meaningfully reduced by the tools available. What nobody knew, what would not be understood until Alexandre Yersin identified the Yersinia pestis bacillus in 1894, and subsequent researchers traced its transmission chain, was that the rat itself was not the weapon. The rat was the carrier. The weapon was smaller, and it jumped. Xenocerla chaopis, the oriental rat flea fed on infected rats, ingested the bacterium, and when its rat host died and the body cooled, went looking for the next available warm body. In the absence of another rat, a human would do. The flea bit. The bacterium entered the lymphatic system. The nodes swelled into buboes. The fever spiked. The person had, on average, between 2 and 7 days. Your manor had rats. This was not a reflection on your housekeeping, your wealth, your moral character, or your domestic management. Every manor in England had rats. Every castle in France had rats. Every merchant's warehouse in Genoa. Every monastery in Germany. Every royal palace in the whole of Europe had rats, running their invisible parallel households within the visible ones, living in the walls and under the floors and along the roof beams with the tenure of creatures who had been there longer than the current residents, and fully intended to outlast them. In a normal year, this was a nuisance with a cost measured in lost grain and chewed wood. In 1347, as infected rats began dying in large numbers, and their fleas began seeking new hosts with escalating urgency, the rat became something else entirely, the mechanism of the worst demographic catastrophe in recorded European history, going about its ordinary business with complete indifference to the consequences. The cat sat in the kitchen. The rat ran along the wall. The flea jumped. And the thing that would kill half of Europe was already inside, and had been for days, and nobody knew to look for it in the place it actually lived. Let's talk about wills, because in a plague year the medieval will becomes something more than a legal instrument. It becomes a window into the specific, urgent psychology of people who are arranging for a death they hope is not coming while understanding, with a clarity that ordinary life rarely forces, that it might arrive before the ink is dry. The wealthy had always made wills. State management required them, and the orderly transfer of property across generations was one of the primary functions of the legal frameworks that wealthy medieval families spent considerable resources maintaining. A wealthy person without a will in the 14th century was an invitation to the kind of dispute that could consume an estate in legal proceedings for decades, enriching lawyers and impoverishing heirs in equal measure. Wills were practical. They were also, in the ordinary run of medieval life, documents written at leisure, revised occasionally, and executed at whatever distant point death eventually arrived. Plague year wills are different, and the difference is legible across 700 years of archival distance. They are urgent in a way that normal wills are not. They are written quickly, sometimes dictated from beds by people who are already sick, sometimes completed by notaries working at speed through households where multiple family members are dying simultaneously. They are revised with a frequency that tells its own story, the same testator appearing in records with a January will, a March revision, a May revision, each one reflecting a changed picture of who remains alive to inherit and what charitable obligations feel most pressing in the current circumstances. Reading the revision history of a plague year will is reading a family's loss in real time, one document at a time. The charitable bequests in these documents accelerated dramatically, and this pattern holds across surviving records from England, France, Italy, and the German territories, with enough consistency to be called a phenomenon rather than a coincidence. Donations to hospitals increased, endowments for masses said in perpetuity for the souls of the dead multiplied, gifts to leper houses, to religious foundations, to the repair of church buildings, to the relief of the poor, all of these appear in plague year wills at rates significantly higher than in the documents produced by the same social class in the decades before. Whether this reflects genuine spiritual transformation, calculated investment in afterlife outcomes, the social pressure of a community watching how its wealthy members behaved in crisis, or the simple logic that you cannot take silver to the grave and you might as well direct it somewhere useful, the answer is probably all of these things at once, in proportions that varied by individual and shifted from week to week as the news from outside grew worse. The specific bequests in these wills also record with an intimacy that formal historical narrative cannot quite replicate the social world of the wealthy as it was being dismantled. A will that names a beloved steward in January and notes his death in a March revision. A bequest to a brother amended because the brother is gone before the amendment is executed. Children named as heirs in the order of their birth, the eldest crossed out, then the second. The provision eventually reaching a nephew in another county who did not know he was being thought of. These documents are grief made administrative. They are the attempt to impose order on a situation that had stopped responding to order, and reading them now is to feel, across the centuries, the specific texture of what it meant to be a person of resources, watching the limits of resources in real time. You sit at your writing table. The notary is across from you with his parchment and his ink. The candle throws warm light across the room. You've done this before, twice this year, and each time the document has looked different because the world has looked different. You begin again. The notary writes carefully. You speak carefully. Somewhere outside a bell begins to ring, and neither of you acknowledges it. and neither of you stops. Let's talk about the question we have been circling since the beginning, the one embedded in the title, the one that every segment has approached from a different angle with a different piece of evidence and a different shade of answer. Would your money have saved you? Would being wealthy during the Black Death, with the stone manor and the sealed gate and the stocked undercroft and the private physician and the country estate and the locked spice chest and the plague doctor in his beaked mask and the priest saying masses every morning in your private chapel, would any of it, or all of it together, have been enough? The honest answer, the one that the historical record supports, and that every segment of this story has been quietly building toward, is maybe, probably somewhat, not reliably, not certainly. Not in the way that money usually functions, which is to say, not in the way that converts resources into outcomes with the dependable consistency that wealth in ordinary times leads you to expect. The wealthy survived the Black Death at rates that were modestly better than the general population in some analyses of surviving evidence and essentially indistinguishable from it in others, and the variation between those findings is itself informative. The advantage of wealth during the plague was real: early flight, household isolation, better baseline nutrition, reduced exposure to urban density. But it was not large, and it was not consistent, and it was entirely dependent on timing and circumstances that money could influence, but not control. The household that sealed its gates in September before the infected servant came home from the October market survived better than the household that sealed its gates in November after the infection was already inside. The difference between those two households was not wealth. It was the specific date of a specific decision and the specific location of a specific flea on a specific Tuesday, and no amount of silver in any chest could have told you which Tuesday mattered. The plague killed members of royal families. It killed the Archbishop of Canterbury twice, 2 archbishops in quick succession. It killed cardinal after cardinal in Avignon, where the Pope was residing, until Clement VI took to sitting alone between 2 large fires, because his physicians had told him that fire purified the air and he needed to reduce his human contact, which was one of the more accidentally sensible pieces of advice medieval medicine produced. It killed the physicians who came to treat it. It killed the priests who came to administer last rites. It killed the servants of the wealthy, and through those servants it killed the wealthy themselves. And it did all of this with a thoroughness that made the distinction between rich and poor feel, in the worst months, like a distinction the plague had not been informed of and did not consider itself bound by. What wealth bought you in the final accounting was not immunity and not safety, but something more modest and more real, a better set of odds in a game where the odds were terrible for everyone, and a better quality of experience at every stage, including the worst stages. It bought you time to flee, to prepare, to try one more thing, to put your affairs in order with some care rather than in desperate haste. It bought you attendance, people who knew your name sitting with you through the fever nights rather than strangers or nobody. It bought you the last rites delivered by your own priest in your own chapel, rather than a harried clergyman administering them in batches at the edge of a mass grave. It bought you a coffin and a grave with your name on it, and masses said for your soul by someone who had said them for you before, and would remember saying them. These things mattered. They are not nothing. The difference between dying attended and dying alone, between dying with the full ceremony of the Church's comfort and dying without it, between being remembered by name and being a number in a death toll, these distinctions were real, and they were significant to the people who experienced them, and to the families who had to live afterward with the knowledge of how it went. But here, at the end of the long day we have spent together in the 14th century, is the thing that sits underneath all of it. The thing that the Black Death revealed about wealth that wealth had spent centuries successfully concealing. Money in the medieval world was very good at arranging the world into a more acceptable shape. It was very good at converting problems into solutions, discomfort into comfort, danger into managed risk. It had been doing this so consistently and so effectively for so long that the people who had it had stopped noticing it was an arrangement rather than a fact. The world was arranged this way. The world had always been arranged this way. The arrangement was the world. The play came through the arrangement like a draft through a tapestry, not destroying it. The tapestry was still on the wall when the draft passed, but making it visible, briefly and devastatingly, as a thing that had been hung there by human hands and could be moved. You're lying in your good bed, in your clean linen, in your stone manor, with the fire burning low and the physician's last visit behind you, and the priest on his way, and the chest full of silver 2 floors below where you cannot reach it. You understand something tonight, that your wealth spent your entire life making it comfortable not to understand. The money was real. The chest was real. The silver was heavy and cold and genuinely there. And outside the gate, in the dark, the rats were still running. And it was, in this particular moment, completely beside the point. Sleep well.